If there's one thing every lazy 3D artist like myself needs to learn, it's probably modular environments and trim sheets. Welcome back to The Breakdown, where we have talented artists take over the channel for the day and share some of their knowledge with the rest of the 3D community. In this video, the very talented Thomas is going to break down his beautiful stylized environment and teach us how he created and utilized a trim sheet to create his modular environment. Now, speaking of environments, if you want to learn how to make environments like these in Unreal Engine, you'll definitely need to check out my Environment Artist course, where I teach you how to create beautiful environments like the one you see on your screen now. From trees to rocks, flowing grass, and landscapes, my beginner Unreal Engine course has it all. So if you're interested, I'll leave a link in the description if you want to check it out. Now, let's get into the video.
Hello everyone, my name is Thomas and I'm creating stylized art in my spare time, and today I'm going to do a small breakdown of my scene called Merchant in the Valley. First of all, I'm going to show you how to set up a trim sheet in Blender and sculpt it in ZBrush. As you can see in this scene, all the wooden parts and all the props are just using one sheet or one trim sheet. After that, I'm going to show you the modular pieces or the modularity of the house. After that, I'm going to explain how I created these flower patches and how you can easily change the colors and the shapes using a color atlas. And lastly, I'm going to show you how I created these trees and the foliage shader inside Unreal Engine. Before we can start with our trim sheets, we need to prepare, or we need to know how we're going to tackle our UV space. So for a wooden beam, we will have 6 sides, so 4 side pieces and 2 top pieces. So the 4 side pieces will be tiling into the X direction and will be placed on top. The 2 side pieces will be unique. We can also add other materials to our trim sheet, like a metal slab. This trim sheet can also be used to texture other assets or props in the scene. In Blender, we can add a plane to create a trim texture. I'm going to change the dimensions to 1 by 1, like this. As I mentioned earlier, we need to subdivide this plane into 6 pieces. Yes. So the first 4 will be used for the side pieces of the wood. Here we will create the top piece, and the last one will be some kind of a metal slab. So now I'm going to create, First, we need to check something. So we must be certain that this texture is completely covering the complete UV space. So I'm going to UV editing. I'm going to select everything with pressing A, and as you can see, it is perfectly covering the completely UV space. So that's okay. It's very important that this is set up properly. So we can go back to edit mode. For the first side piece of the wood, I'm going to create some geometry. So I'm going to subdivide it. I'm going to scale these edges into the Y direction, and I'm going to move the center face into the Z direction. In ZBrush, we're going to sculpt on these edges here. So this edge and also this edge. And I don't want to have a perfect vertical edge, but I want to have some kind of slope, some angle here, because the baking results will be much better when it's sloped a little bit. I'm also going to do this for all the 3 different pieces and also for the metal slab. For the top pieces, I'm first going to separate this face with pressing P, separating by selection. I'm selecting only this part, and I'm going back into edit mode. I want to add a subdivision to create 2 rectangular faces like this. So this face we're not going to use. You can add some unique textures here or some planks or anything you like, but I'm going to delete this for this tutorial. I'm going to select these 2 faces, inset these faces like this, and again raise the center face to create the sloped edges here. All right. In ZBrush, we're going to add the wood grains on this face, but we want to have it tiling into the X direction. So what we will need to do is we will need to set up the mesh firstly before we can export it into ZBrush. So I'm going to add a plane. So the plane has dimensions 2 by 2. So this will be good for wrapping around the sculpt. So in the mesh, I'm going to scale this one into the X direction. I'm going to scale it by 2 so it lines up perfectly with the plane. So like this. So now we will have our texture will be of 1 by 1 will be in the middle, and the sculpt will be wrapped around the edges to get a tileable sculpt or a tileable texture. Before we can add this, I'm going to explain this in more detail into ZBrush later on. Before we can add this to ZBrush, I want to add some extra subdivisions to create some nice rectangular faces like this. And also for the metal slab. What I forgot to do was I want to separate these pieces. I'm separating them by pressing P by selection. I'm separating these because it's easier in ZBrush to set up the polygroups and therefore splitting the mesh into different parts like this. And after that I'm going to join them again, but even after they're joined they're going to stay separate meshes. So I can, with L, I can select them separately like this. All right, so now we have our mesh set up in Blender. We can export this as an OBJ. So I already exported it, but it's going to be wood trim sheet import, and I'm going to export this selection only. All right, we imported the mesh into ZBrush, and in subtools I split all the mesh into different parts so we can select them with Alt. It's easier to sculpt. I already subdivided the geometry using the divide and the smooth option. For sculpting the edge wear or the damages on the edges, I'm going to use the trim dynamic brush. What we need to do to get the tiling, we go to the option menu brush, and under curve we're going to set the wrap mode to 2. Very importantly, we need to do this for every mesh separately, so we can start sculpting on this mesh. So as you can see, the brush is styled into the X direction. For the wood grains, I'm using the Orbs brush pack. And again, we need to change the wrap mode to 2. In Blender, we can import the ZBrush file or the Zbrush export. So here's the wood trim sheets export. It's like this. So we can immediately export this as our trim sheet, our high poly. So I'm going to only export the selected one. And for the low poly, I'm going to export a plane just with dimensions 1 by 1. That is going to be the trim texture. So I'm going to export this as an FBX as the trim low. In Substance Painter, I baked the high poly mesh onto the low poly mesh or onto the texture plane. So the wood, it consists of just the base color with the roughness value of 0.9. After that, it's a darker color with the dirt mask to create some color variation. Again, I added some moss to create again some color variation. After that, I have an ambient occlusion layer for the large spots and some for the wood grains. And after that, I also created an edge highlight layer that's using the light mask to emphasize the edge wear on the sides of the wood. For the metal one, it's the metal parts. It's the same setup. So a base color, a dirt layer with a darker color. In this case, some rust color to create some color variations. The ambient occlusion layers, and again edge highlight. So we can use this texture and export it to be used in Unreal. After we created the texture and Substance Painter, we also need to UV unwrap some kind of beam that will be using the trim sheet. So in this example, I already created a wooden beam. So I'm going to select a side piece. So it will be using the wood grains, but it just overlaps with the edge damage or the edge wear. So if I select all faces, these are UV unwrapped like this. What you can do, because it's styling in the X directions, you can also change the UV unwrap. If you have a lot of beams, you can create some uniqueness by shifting this in the X direction. So now I can show you some modular pieces or my build kit that I used to create the house. In Blender, I started with two different planes. So a small plane with the dimensions of 1 by 2 and the large plane 2 by 2. And all the other pieces are following these dimensions. For the plaster, I created two different textures. The first one is a very simple or a very basic texture. It contains some, in Substance Designer, I stacked some noises on top of each other, and I added some color variation by scattering some Photoshop brushes around. The second texture is a brick texture, as you can see here, and I added some wear and tear on the edges of the plaster using a slope blur. And in my final piece, I use vertex painting to create some unique spots in the plaster. I don't do it in the shader because it's a very small house and it's easily managed using or painting the vertex color manually. Here at the bottom, you can also see some grunge spots. So I did this in the shader by using a linear gradient. I can quickly show you. So here I used the linear gradient in the Y direction. I used a constant factor to control the hardness or the softness of the gradient. Then I used some grunge textures from Substance Designer and I multiplied it with the gradient. And here you can see we get some grunge spots at the bottom. I used the lerp to lerp in the unsaturated dark green color at the bottom, and I lerped this with the basic textures that I showed you earlier. Then we can look at the wall pieces. In Blender, I created two very basic shapes, very small basic pieces, and one large piece, just a very basic one. I also created 5 different beams with different sizes. And I used these ones to add some extra beams to the walls like this, so I can add some extra pieces here to get some other variations. These wooden beams are using the trim sheets that I showed you earlier, but I created in Substance Painter, I created 3 different color variations. So this one are the medium colors. So I also have a light variation and also a dark variation, so I can quickly add some uniqueness to my structure or to my building by using this method. Here we also have a very small wall piece. So I created, I think, 4 different bricks, sculpted them in ZBrush, baked them onto a low poly, and then also painted, textured them in Substance Painter. And here I can quickly make just a very small wall piece. Here we can look at the roof piece. So the roof piece is one large piece because I made it a little bit crooked in Blender, and it's much easier to make it one piece. The roof tiling are also 9 different unique pieces that I sculpted and textured in Substance Painter. And then in Blender, I randomly placed them onto a plane, and then I created this roof. I want to give you a quick overview of how I created my landscape and also the foliage in the scene. First of all, the landscape just contains 3 different layers with a simple color, and they all share the same basic normal map. The grass is created by following a tutorial by Stylized Station. I will put the link in the description, but I can show you my grass mesh. So I created a large one and 2 small ones, but they have different colors. So the large one, as you can see, it's a linear gradient with a green color at the bottom and a yellowish unsaturated color at the top. In your modeling software, it's very important to align the normals in the Z direction or completely vertical to get correct shading. To get some variation, I also created some other types of plants. I used the foliage system to place all the plants in my scene. Even the rocks, the small rocks here, are placed using the foliage system. I can also show you how I created the vines on the house. These are not using the foliage system because I wanted to have control where I would place these vines. I can show you the material. So in ZBrush I sculpted 3 different leaves, and in Blender I stacked them on top of each other to create these types of vines, and I baked them in Substance Painter, and these are all using planes with an opacity mask. Next we can look at our flower mesh. So I will hide my grass mesh. I will grab my flower mesh and put it in the middle. So here you can see our flower mesh. So it's a small flower patch that contains a small plane at the top that will hold the flower, and then a small triangle mesh that contains the root of the flower. Very importantly here is that we change all the normals to point upwards. So again, I will select everything of the mesh and I will click on Alt N, and then I will click on point to target and click again somewhere above the target and pick a very large value here. So now again we can see that the normals are all facing upwards. For the flowers, I created a color atlas. So it's something like this. It's 4 different colors. So the green color is for the roots or the stem of the flower, and then it's 3 different colors for the flower. So I will have a white flower, a red flower, and a yellow flower. I also created an opacity mask for each different kind of color. So the white flower will have this shape, the red one will have this shape, and then the yellow will have this shape. So you can easily change the shapes or the colors of all the flowers, and you can easily manage and create all different kinds of flowers. So if you go to Blender, as you can see, it's very important to do a proper UV unwrap of the planes to match the colors of the atlas. So if you go to the UV editing, so here I already unwrapped the planes onto the white plane, and this one I can export it as an FBX to the flower white. So I can export it again, then I go back into edit mode, and I can move the UV unwrap to the red space like this. And then again I can do export FBX, and then I can export it as the red. I can export it as the red flower in object mode, of course, like this. And then we can do it one last time for the yellow flowers. We need to make it a little bit bigger, like this. Okay, export it as an FBX, yellow. Then we can go back to Unreal. Then we can import all the different flowers. Import all. Okay, so we can test one. This here we can click on the mesh. We open the mesh. So these are the the 3 different flowers. So we first need to create a material. So here is the color atlas for the flowers and also the opacity masks. So I created a very basic material with the color atlas into the base color, a roughness value of 0.9, and also an opacity mask. To use the opacity mask, you need to change the blend mode here to masked. If we then click on the mesh of the red flower here, and we select the flower materials, you can clearly see that we have the red flower. So that's very nicely. If you go to the white flowers, we select the material, we will have the white flowers. We go back to the yellow, we select the flower material, and now we will have the yellow flowers. Okay, so these are set up. Then we can add them to our foliage menu. Here we can select all the flowers, and very importantly is to deselect the cast shadow options as we did before with the grass strands. We can also change the density because we already have 3 flowers for 1 patch, so I will change this to 5. And then we can paint in the flowers, and we have a very nice flower. We can very nicely create a flower patch in our grass. As you can see here, the flowers are a little bit raised below the grass, so we can change the scaling inside the menu. So scaling 3, and then we can scale here from 1 to maybe 2, and then we can try it again here, and you can see that the flowers will be much higher and will be above the grass. Before we're going to start creating the trees in Blender, I'm going to show you how I set them up in Unreal. So first of all, the branch here is very low poly with it's just a noise stretched in the X direction. So the branches are using geometry. So these are created in Blender using planes, and all these planes are using an opacity mask. So in Blender I can show you how I create the geometry. So first of all, I started with a plane. So the plane, I'm going to rotate again. I'm going to duplicate it, and I'm going to rotate it in the Y direction, 90 degrees. I'm going to duplicate it again and rotate it in the Z direction, like this. Alright, so this this shape, you will be scattering it around another shape. So for creating the branch, I'm going to use an Icosphere. So I'm going to scale it up a little bit, and with proportional editing, I'm going to change the shape a little bit. So something like this. So something like this could be a nice shape for a tree. So I'm going to use a particle system. I'm going to add a particle system to scatter around this shape. So I'm going to use the hair one. I'm going to click on advanced. And as you can see now, you don't have a very nice or very uniform scattering shape of the hair. So first I'm going to go back again to the modifier, and I'm going to add a subdivision surface. So I'm going to move to first, yes. So I'm going to add some more subdivisions to the shape. I'm going to add it. So now you can see that the hairs are more uniformly scattering around the shape, so that's much better. So I'm going back to the particle system. So hair, I'm going to click on advanced. I'm going to change the number to something like 75. Then I'm going to change the render as path to render as an object. I'm going to, with the pin drop, I'm going to select our object here. And as you can see now, these are all nicely scattering at the edge of the shape. So I'm going to increase the scale So something like this. But what we can do is this this particle system is using this shape. So I can, if I change this shape, everything will also change in the particle system. So I can move this in the Z direction so that our origin is at the middle of our cross here. By default, the orientation axis will be equal to velocity hair. But as you can see here, we have a very sharp corner or a very sharp shape, and therefore no hairs or no particles will be placed at this side. So we can change the orientation axis from velocity hair to normal tangent so that all the cards will be placed perpendicular to the faces like this. So we get a very nice shape here. But here we have some blank spots, and you can change the seed number to get some nice scattering or some variations in scattering. So I can change this to 11, looks also very nice, or even 10. Okay, so this one looks okay. Maybe back to 11. Yes. So as you can see here, there are a lot of cards that are parallel with each other, so therefore I'm going to randomize the face here a little bit so that all the cards will change in direction or in rotation. So something like this, that we don't have a lot of uniformity. And we can also add a randomness to the scale a little bit like this. So I'm pretty happy with this result, I think. You have to change this, you have to import this into Unreal and keep changing it to get a perfect tree. Before we can export this mesh to Unreal, we need to convert this. So I'm going to click on convert, and then I'm going to duplicate the mesh with Shift D and move it into the X direction. I'm going to join the mesh together like this one. So now we have a very nice tree mesh, as you can see here. But what we still need to change is the direction of the normals. So in edit mode, here we can see the direction of the normals. So you can click it, you can activate it in this menu here. I can increase the size to like this. All right, as you can see, we will not have a very uniform shading if we will use this mesh in Unreal. So we will need to edit the normals. So I'm going to add a modifier with a normal edit, like this one. So before we can use this, we need to enable auto smooth and object data. So we go to the normals, click on auto smooth, otherwise it's not going to work. So for editing the normals, we will need a new object, which we can copy its normal information. So we're going to add an icosphere, and this icosphere needs to completely encapsulate the mesh, the tree mesh, so like this. All right, I'm going to back to wireframe. I'm going to select the old mesh. So here I'm going to at target, I'm going to use the pinpoint to select the icosphere or the outer mesh like this, and I'm going to click on apply. So we can delete the outer mesh, and we can go back to here into edit mode. And as you can see, all the meshes, all the normals are facing radially outward. So now we can export this to Unreal Engine, export this as an FBX. So I'm going to export this as tree test. I'm going to export only the selected object, export this, okay. Now we can add our tree mesh to the scene. Here you can see clearly by adding or by altering the normals in Blender, we can see that we have an edge highlight at the top of the mesh by the sun or by the lightning, and at the bottom we get our shadows. Here you can see all the cards that will be using the opacity masks. The material that I created for the foliage, so I created a master material. In the master material, I'm just very simple blending between two colors using a vertical gradient. And I'm adding a very dark color at the base of the texture to create a shadow effect. For the opacity mask, I'm just using a very simple texture that I created in Krita, and I'm using a simple grasswind node to get the shadow or shadow effect for the mesh. I created an instance of the master material so I can easily change the colors and also the intensity of the wind. it's this material, and I'm going to add it to the branch, as you can see. So it looks very nicely, and I'm also using this one for the bushes in the scene. So I'm just scaling them into the Z direction. Alright everyone, we are at the end of the breakdown. I hope you learned something today, and if you want some more information or if you want to ask a question, you can always contact me on ArtStation.